Well, our final speaker for the afternoon is somebody who's been a terrific collaborator and a colleague, and I think a steward of our environment for the state, Sheila Holman, who's going to be talking about progress in improving air quality. Sheila?
Thank you, Kim, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to do a little bit of repeat in terms of talking about how we got to 2016 and how we got to that laudable goal of achieving all of the ambient air quality standards all across North Carolina. And I'll have some visuals to kind of reinforce the first couple parts of the story that Bill told. And I'm going to make a mental note to never agree to go after Bill Ross in a session. He's a tough act to follow. I do also want to thank Kim and Julia for their work in trying to quantify what are those health benefits from implementing the Clean Smokestacks Act as well as other environmental measures. That's a skill set that we don't have at the state, and at least in the Department of Environmental Quality. So it's been a really good partnership to try and look at the benefits, the health benefits from having such tremendous emission reductions. So what I want to do is really highlight some of the elements and underscore much of what Bill said about the Clean Smokestacks Act. Talk some about the other measures that improved air quality through the years, and then talk in general terms about the impacts. And I'll wrap up with a little bit of, so you've achieved all of the ambient air quality standards, is it time to declare victory and go home? Well, no, there's obviously more work to be done. So I'll talk a little bit about the work I see ahead for the division in continuing to address air quality issues. So again, painting that picture, we had new ambient standards for the country for both ozone and a brand new fine particle standard. And we had just gathered 3 years worth of data as the legislation was being contemplated in the General Assembly. A little bit about how the Clean Air Act works. So EPA sets the national health-based standards, and then the states are responsible not only for monitoring for the pollution, but also then if we have violating areas, we have to develop a plan, and we have to figure out how do we bring the emissions down, and how do we get all of those ambient air quality monitors back into compliance. At the time that the legislation was being contemplated, my role at the division was I headed up the attainment planning branch, and it is just what it sounds like. I needed to figure out how were we going to attain standards, and had a fabulous team of technical people. Many of those technical people were part of that overall team for the Southern Appalachian Mountain Initiative, and Bill talked about the 8 states. If you imagine the Southern Appalachian Mountains, the 8 states starting in the south would be Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia. So those were the 8 states. And so from the state's perspective, we had all of our technical staff looking at things like emission inventories, all the different sources of pollution in each state. We had meteorological modelers, we had ambient air quality modelers, and then of course we had all of the wonderful resources, both on the university front as well as we had industry at the table, and they of course brought their own resources, and just a really good technical effort that was kind of peer-reviewed every step of the way. All of the products were publicly available. The states all had the opportunity to look at the data going into the analysis. So I want to help you understand that 10-year effort led to, I think, very good quality products. And we'll see some of those products in a few minutes. And this, going back to the data, we had all those counties that are shaded in red were counties that were violating the ozone standard. Obviously, we had western sites, we had central Piedmont sites that were violating the standard. The counties shaded in white means there's no ambient monitor there, but you could imagine that if we had a monitor in Davidson County, it would likely be violating. So we were looking at what would be called widespread non-attainment based on those violating monitors. So on the fine particle front, and this would be for all the counties shaded yellow, orange, or red, those would be counties, again, with violating monitors. But again, there were lots of counties that didn't have monitors, but if you put a monitor in, say, Rowan County or Iredell County, it would likely be violating the fine particle standard. So we were going to have lots of areas that were non-attainment. And again, the requirements on the state, if you have violating monitors, is that EPA designates areas as non-attainment, and then the state's responsibility under the Clean Air Act is to develop a plan. And that plan has to have control measures. And we knew enough going into the legislative debate about what was causing much of the problems. Obviously, when we considered ozone and how to lower ozone in the southeastern United States, we knew we should reduce nitrogen oxide emissions. And our greatest sources of nitrogen oxide emissions were the utilities, the coal-fired utilities, and the mobile sources. And then, of course, to reduce fine particles, in addition to knowing our mass, the mass being measured at the monitors, we also had speciated data. So we had speciated filters. They sit out at the monitors, and then they're collected, and then they're analyzed. And about 40% of the speciated data was showing sulfate as the major contribution. So again, sulfur dioxide emissions were important for reducing sulfur dioxide emissions were important to achieving the fine particle standard. And we were also beginning to understand the whole visibility requirements. EPA issued what's called the Regional Haze Rule in 1999, and our first Regional Haze Plan was due in 2007. So all of this combined, sitting there in the attainment planning branch in North Carolina, had me very, very concerned. How are we going to convince everyone that we need significant emission reductions? And this is one of those maps, this is just one example that Bill referred to, that he and Brock Nicholson, Brock I think he was the planning section chief for a part of it, and then he later became the deputy director for the Division of Air Quality. But they attended many, many, many meetings on Clean Smokestacks Act, and I think Kim did a great job of recognizing Bill and Bill's contributions, but they were critical because they were there carrying the message, carrying the technical data, really underscoring the need to take action now. And then, of course, we had people like Hugh Morton saying, we need to do something for our mountains. And coming from our mountains, I actually grew up in Ashe County. I grew up about 60 miles from one of our more beautiful Class 1 areas, the Linville Gorge Wilderness area. So this spoke to me, being a mountain girl and growing up and watching the visibility degrade over time. And then, of course, being in a position where hopefully we can make an impact and make changes. So this is, as I said, one of those maps. This one shows if we were to reduce NOx from the elevated stacks, so from industrial boilers and coal-fired electric generating units, the biggest benefit would be in North Carolina, and it would actually be in that part of North Carolina that had the highest PM 2.5 values. And this shows the impact on ozone. If we reduced nitrogen oxide emissions from, in this case, it was the surface NOx, so this would be mobile sources, for example, the greatest benefit would occur in North Carolina. And again, in, for example, the Charlotte area, which historically has had our highest ozone values. And then this is if we were to reduce NOx from the power plants and from the industrial boilers. Again, if we take action in North Carolina, we can impact the lives of the citizens in North Carolina. And this story is just, to me, a very successful story of collaboration and really getting to what is in the best interest of the states and of the state. I would also say that shortly after Clean Smokestacks Act passed, there was an attempt by Congress to also pass multi-pollutant legislation. In 2003, there was a bill that was being considered. That failed. All the states, they had similar maps to what we had. And the overall conclusion was that the greatest air quality benefit for a state comes from reductions in that state. So each of those 8 states had that same information. And they had people like Bill Ross and Brock Nicholson going to their management and saying, can you do what we did? Can you pass multi-pollutant legislation? You have the technical case, can you do it? At the same time, in addition to the legislation that was being considered, EPA was also looking at developing a transport rule. That is, looking at reducing pollution across the eastern United States to minimize the impact that one state had on another state. So all this was happening, and some of the states said to us, well, no, we're going to wait on either the federal legislation or we're going to wait on the federal rule. There were states that took action. Georgia adopted, I believe in 2007, they adopted a multi-pollutant rule. They had Atlanta sitting there with some of the same issues that many areas of North Carolina had, lots of violating monitors, and so they needed significant reductions. Also, Virginia's, there was a bill introduced in the Virginia General Assembly, but that bill didn't pass. But I think just to help underscore the really great effort that this took and just the significance of this legislation, I wanted to share those things with you. This is all just highlights of the bill. I think as we were considering the construct of the bill, the utilities were offered, well, we could do a statewide cap. They elected to have an entity-wide cap for both NOx and sulfur dioxide. And these, of course, were the caps. There were phase caps for NOx and phase caps for SO2. And, of course, I think one of the primary pieces that helped with getting it through was that cost recovery piece. And it was interesting, especially now to reflect back on those deliberations. The cost recovery piece, that maybe the environmental groups agreed to that because then the utilities agreed to surrender any of those credits. So as the utilities use cost recovery, that is, they were accepting money from the ratepayers to pay for the controls. As the utilities did that, then they would surrender those emission reductions to the state and not trade them on the market, which we knew there would be a market. There was already the market under the acid rain program, and we knew that there would eventually be a market with all the efforts, either by Congress or EPA, to establish a transport rule or multi-pollutant legislation. So it was a lot of give and take, and I think in the end, the winner truly was the state of North Carolina and the citizens. Skip on to this. At the start of the Clean Power Plant or Clean Smokestacks deliberation, there were 14 coal-fired power plants scattered all across the state. This map today reflects those plants that are still operational. Those shaded in black still have coal-fired units at them. There's 7. And then the other 7 have either shut down and they're coal-fired units and they're no longer operating, or they have converted to natural gas. So 7 shut down, and then a few that have converted to natural gas. And so we've seen a diversification in the electric generation in North Carolina. And this table just shows you, for the plants that are still operating, the types of controls that went on, both for NOx and SO2, as well as we saw some improvements in PM 2.5, and then the combination of strategies looking at mercury control. Because over time, we also saw the mercury and air toxic standards that applied to the electric generating units all across the country. That was an EPA rule. And this it is a graphic depiction of what Bill was mentioning about where we started back in 1998, 245,000 tons of NOx, 489,000 tons of SO2. The lines, the dotted lines show the actual caps. This was our NOx cap for 2009. This was the 2009 SO2 cap, and then this is the 2013 SO2 cap. And then what we saw about 2009, Bill talked about the compliance plans. So every year, Duke Energy, and at that time Progress Energy, had to submit to the state a compliance plan. How are they going to achieve the caps, the emissions caps? And there were elements about cost recovery and so forth. So back in 2002, the contemplation was all 14 of those coal-fired units or coal-fired plants would likely still be operating. There were a few that were going to be shuttered, but there would be at least one or more units operating at all 14. In about 2009, as we saw the evolution of the hydraulic fracturing to get to some of the natural gas resources in the U.S., the cost of natural gas, we were seeing climate legislation being debated. The companies made the decision to begin this investment in natural gas. And so what resulted, of course, is that the facility, the emissions now are well below where we thought they would be. And again, we had some additional reductions in volatile organic compounds, PM 2.5, and mercury as co-benefits from the controls going on. I think Julia in one of her slides had that whole laundry list of measures. A lot has happened on the regulatory front for air quality over the last decade or so. And of course, we have federal engine and fuel standards. We have federal industrial standards, both boiler, MACT, and then the MATS rule that I spoke of earlier. We've had different iterations of the transport rule, the Clean Air Transport Rule from 2005, and then later replaced by the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. And most recently, EPA is working on, or just finished the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule for the 2008 ozone standards. We've had state programs put in place. Bill mentioned the Vehicle Emissions Inspection and Maintenance Program. That was part of the governor's plan, Governor Hunt's plan, to address the ozone issues in North Carolina. We had, because of the vacatur of the Boiler MACT rule, we actually put in place what are called 112J, Clean Air Act Section 112J. If EPA has failed to adopt a rule, then it's really up to the states to fill in that need. So we have toxic emission permits for the boilers before the Boiler MACT was actually ever finalized. The final rule that's in place now, still under litigation. And then we've had voluntary programs like Clean School Bus Initiatives. So there's been lots of efforts. Local programs all across the state have also implemented a variety of types of measures. And it's that whole fabric of controls that I think has led us to be where we are today, and that is in compliance with all the standards. And one of the more difficult jobs in trying to convince local communities to take action is that those local measures, they don't really show up on the model. So you can't give them these nice we can't provide nice pictures like that. But as I tell them, it's still very important to your community. And let's talk about things like a school bus diesel retrofit project. For those children riding on that school bus to and from school every day, that is very meaningful to their quality of life. It's never ever going to show up on a model results slide, but it makes the quality of life for those students very, it improves it dramatically. I had an experience with my own daughter. Both of my children are asthmatic, but my youngest child, when she was in elementary school, a new school was built in southern Durham, and all of her friends were wanting to go. We had a choice to leave her at the school she was at, which was about 3.5 miles from our house, or move to the new school, which was about 7 miles. And she wanted to go to the new school, so she went to the new school, and she started coming home complaining of headaches. Every day she was complaining of headaches, and her school bus ride went from about 15 minutes to an hour. You wouldn't think 3.5 miles to 7 miles would result in that, but it does. So this is one of those issues that I feel very personally that we need to do all that we can to make that environment inside that school bus as healthy as it can be. Due to my, seeing my own child, her impact in riding that school bus every day. So back to the overall list. It takes all of that to improve air quality. And sometimes I think those smaller local measures are just as important to the community that's impacted as the big measures. But we definitely would not be here without those very significant NOx and SO2 reductions from Clean Smokestacks Act. The next few slides just show you some benefits that we've seen over time, and it's showing the green line is the old 1 hour NACs, and we are now well below that limit. The blue line is the 97 NACs, and then we've added in the 2008 and the 2015 NACs, just to show you that over time what the values have looked like. This is just a map of the design values from 2013 to 2015. The new standard that EPA promulgated last October is set at 70 parts per billion. Charlotte remains the area with the highest ozone design value. For that window of time, 2013 to 2015, the value was 68 parts per billion. So it's close. Then as we shift to 2014 to 2016, and let me say the 2016 data, we're still in that detailed quality assurance step. I don't expect these values to change dramatically, but I do need you to know that this isn't fully certified data yet. But the value in the Charlotte area went up to 70. It's considered a violation of the new standard for the 3-year design value to be 71 or higher. So we're still in compliance, just barely. There's some good news in terms of the low-level NOx emissions. I think next year, starting in January 1, we're going to see the Tier 3 fuel standards take effect. And so the emissions from the automobiles, because of those cleaner fuels, we're going to see emissions reductions from the mobile sector. And so, we continue to watch the values there. We continue to look at a variety of programs. We work closely with Mecklenburg County Air Quality, the local air program, and they continue their efforts with some diesel retrofit projects. They've been very successful in converting some of the, not only school buses, but also construction equipment, airport equipment. And so they continue to do those local projects, and we continue to look at all the things that other actions that we may be able to take, again, to reduce pollution and to stay in compliance with this new standard. Recommendations on what areas of North Carolina should be designated as non-attainment, they were due to EPA. On October 1, we did make a submittal that recommends that all counties be designated attainment. That was based on the 2013 to 2015 quality assured data, as well as the preliminary data from 2014 to 2016. EPA will finalize designations next October. So, and I'm sure that we'll be watching the ozone data in 2017 to determine if we should change the recommendation. For PM 2.5, we've seen dramatic improvements on both the 24-hour standard and the annual standard. Design values are generally in the range of 8 to 9 across much of the Piedmont. Our highest value is actually in Wake County now at 10.7. The annual standard is set at 12 micrograms per cubic meter. So that's the good news story on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. I spoke earlier about regional haze, and so I want to talk a little bit about the improvements we've seen in visibility, due in large part to these reductions. So when we started our work on regional haze, it was kind of in parallel with the work that was going on at the General Assembly. We began the technical analysis around 2001, and that was, it was the 8 SAMI states plus Florida and Mississippi, because they made up the Southeastern Regional Planning Organization. And so we started with the data. What did the data tell us? Well, it said on the 20% worst visibility days, you know, when you go to the mountains and it looks a little bit like pea soup, sulfate dominates the light extinction. So sulfate was causing the majority of the visibility impairment. Organic carbon was generally the second largest, and there was impacts from wildfires or prescribed fires on some of the days. And then the nitrate contribution, that coming from NOx, if you will, was comparatively small, and I'll again have some visuals to help with that. The interesting thing too is that sulfate also dominates on the 20% best visibility days. But what that led the 10 states to conclude is that we need to focus on reducing sulfur dioxide emissions. We did a lot of modeling analyses to say how will the visibility respond to different types of emission reductions. And so we studied this bar chart. The tall bar chart is for looking at sulfur dioxide emission reductions from the coal-fired power plants across the domain. And this would be reducing sulfur dioxide from the industrial sector, the industrial coal-fired boilers. And then these smaller bars are all from different other types of emissions. Ammonia, nitrogen oxides, ground, again, more the mobile and non-road sector, NOx from the industrial sector, and volatile organic compounds, and then primary carbon from different types of emission sources. But again, we looked at it and said, well, of course we need to focus on the EGUs and the industrial boilers. So we proceeded to do that and submitted plans. Obviously, we relied a lot on the Clean Smokestacks Act. This map, actually the next few slides actually comes from Jim Renfro. He's the air quality specialist at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and he was one of our partners as we went through the regional haze planning process. So he looked at, he pulled the different monitors from around the park, and he also added Haywood County, North Carolina. The park sits in part of Haywood County, but we have another monitor just outside the park, so he's added that in. And so what he saw, let me get back one, sorry. For the annual PM 2.5 standard, there's been a 50% reduction in the PM 2.5 levels. We had values in the 15, 16, 18 microgram per cubic meter range back in 1999 to 2001 timeframe. Now we're down to values in the 6 to 9 microgram per cubic meter range. So consider hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains and having PM 2.5 values in the 16, 17, 18 microgram range to now when you go and you're seeing values in the 7, 8, 9 range. I think the health effects are tremendous, but also just the overall experience is going to be better. And similar kind of statistics for the 24-hour average, there has been a 55% decrease. I talked about the sulfate dominating. So this shows the history from of the data from 1990 to 2014. Most of the reductions occurred starting in 2005, and they were generally achieved by about 2011, 2012. So you can see that over that period of time, the overall impairment, so the higher the bar, the greater the visibility impairment. And we had values in the 260, 270, 280 range back in the 90s. Now that it's down to, it's in the 50 range for light extinction. This is a product, and I'll kind of walk you through this. So first of all, this is the visibility data. These black diamonds represent the visibility impairment on the worst days. This is on our best days. And these are actual data points. So when we were developing the plan, we were focused especially on 2000 to 2004 time frame, and then we project forward from there. So this line is the projection out to 2064. The Regional Haze Rule says that we need to do these incremental planning horizons with the overall goal to return regional haze to natural background by 2064. So to get to where the mountain visibility would have been before industrial development. And the line is the term that we refer to in the planning process is the uniform rate of progress. So you want to make sure you're getting to this ultimate goal, you want to be making progress. So in 2007, or 2005, 6, and 7, the states were all projecting what would the emissions be based on their legislation, or our legislation like clean smokestacks, or the EPA transport rule, the Clean Air Interstate rule. So we did all of our projections, and we projected that we would be here. So we would be better than the uniform rate of progress. Where we actually are, this is, again, Jim Renfro's work, for 2015, we're estimated to be almost where we would need to be in 2038. So tremendous, tremendous improvement in visibility. Now, I knew that we were doing better than what we thought we would and the emissions that we had put into that future year model in 2018. But I also wanted to look at what were the other states doing. And so the orange bar is the predicted, our predicted or estimated emissions for 2018. Again, with what we knew in 2005, 2006. And it was basically almost 1.5 million tons of SO2 would still be going into the atmosphere in 2018. That was even with CARE, it was with clean smokestacks. The blue bar is the actual emissions that were put into the atmosphere from the electric generating units in 2015. And it's 900,000 tons less sulfur dioxide than what we had projected. So it's not just North Carolina going further and doing more, it's lots of the other states as well. And this one just compares and contrasts the extinction data from the worst days and the best days, and the really good news is that these worst days are getting closer and closer to the values we're seeing on the best days, which leads us to that better experience at the Class 1 areas. This is at Purchase Knob. It's in the eastern edge of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The picture on the left is from 2005, again, as we were just starting to see that first scrubber go on at the Asheville plant, the Duke Energy, or at the time it's Progress Energy plant in Asheville. And then this second view is from August of 2015. And I'll share with you, this was from, I told you I was a mountain girl, so we spend a lot of our vacations in the mountains. Living here in the Raleigh-Durham area, I like to get back west as much as I can. This was from August of 2015, and this is very near the Shining Rock Wilderness area. This is the Devil's Courthouse viewpoint from the Blue Ridge Parkway. And this was a relatively high humidity day. So the really beautiful news is that this is becoming more the rule in terms of the experience that we have as we go to our mountains and get out and go hiking. It's more the rule than the exception. It used to be more the exception than the rule, so lots of great progress. I'm going to skip through these summaries. I think, and the studies, because Bill touched on all of those. And I want to talk more about kind of the challenges ahead. One thing that I would note is that as Duke Energy and Progress Energy began to implement the controls, they did a lot in terms of efficiency improvements at their facilities. And what that meant was that between 2005 and 2013, we saw significant CO2 reductions. And both in terms of the rate, we saw a reduction of almost 19% in the rate, and about 26% in terms of the mass. So there's also other benefits that haven't been talked about yet today. Obviously, what happens with the Clean Power Plan and the litigation. What I would say is we don't know what's going to happen with that. But if we are looking at implementing a Clean Power Plan in the future, a lot of the work to position and do some reductions and make those units as efficient as possible have been undertaken. And so I think we can also say that there's been significant CO2 reductions. So going forward, I want to talk briefly about our challenges. And obviously one challenge is not becoming a victim of our own success in that we lose lots and lots of funding for our program, because I think there is more work to be done. Julia mentioned that there are benefits that can be achieved to the public health if you're seeing lower and lower values, particularly for those non-threshold pollutants like ozone and PM 2.5. So we have some opportunities. One of the things that we are doing right now is looking very carefully at something called EPA's Advanced Program. That is a program to engage with the local communities to continue to look at emission reductions, voluntary and otherwise, that can improve the air quality in the communities. We are also looking at implementation of the Volkswagen settlement. North Carolina, I believe in the mitigation dollars, we're going to get something like $87 million to do mitigation projects and reduce NOx emissions, further reduce NOx emissions in the state. So that is another key priority as we go forward. And then, of course, depending on the outcome of the Clean Power Plan litigation, we may be looking at developing a plan to address that final rule. So there's lots of challenges, I think, that lie ahead, and obviously we want to continue to keep the quality of program that we have, keep developing good technical analyses, work with the communities, work with the research community to gather those data points and the technical evaluations so that we can help with influencing policy moving forward. Again, I can't say enough about the SAMI effort and the value of that technical work, the quality of the technical work that helped lead to good policy decisions, and I hope you'll agree with me, really good outcomes for the state of North Carolina. It's been a pleasure being with you today. I'll be happy to take questions if you have them.
Thanks, Sheila. That was a terrific perspective, and again, it's really great data. One of the things I would say is that in interacting with Sheila, there's this wealth of data that exists. It's available and it's accessible. You sort of have to go after it and engage and pull that down. And I think that without Sheila's leadership in helping us obtain that, some of the things we have done, we couldn't have done. Now, one thing I'll tell you that Julie and I have been doing is we've tried to reduce the the matrix of information about health to at least the zip code level in North Carolina. So there are about 100 counties, but there are, how many zip code levels? 18,000 or 8,000 zip codes. So the granularity of that data is much greater with the zip codes. And because of that effort, and again, we're looking at other sources of pollution, and your map of the power plants seemed to be quite interesting. And one of the questions I had was, what do you think about the opportunity to look at the presence and then absence of a power plant as perhaps a clear transition point from a source of pollution to an absent source? And would that be, again, another natural experiment in which the health effects of that reduction in pollution could be measured as far as true health benefits? So is that information public, the location and time of decommissioning of any of those power plants?
That is all public information, and we can certainly point you to that. I think the Wilmington area in particular might be a great case study because we've seen plant closures, not just the Sutton Power Plant in Wilmington, where it changed from coal-fired units to new natural gas combined cycle units, but we've also seen DAC Americas closed, Invista closed. There were several industrial facilities there that had SO2 emissions, and so that in particular could be really a good case study, and we can also look at the timing of those various plant closures. But we can provide any of the data and the closure deadlines.
So the other question I had was, again, in your role as in North Carolina, and the success of this narrative is, terrific. But one thing that we think about is, comparators. So are there states that over the past 10 or 15 years haven't achieved the level of improvements that you would see North Carolina? Is there an outlier that just chugs along and just does the bare minimum at the federal level, and so their air quality would be considered to be not achieving the improvements that North Carolina has? Again, just the nefarious idea is that might be an interesting comparator as far as the health outcomes if there weren't the improvements in air quality. Do you have some sense of the states that perhaps haven't done as well?
Well, I think, and reflecting back on the bar chart that showed the predicted SO2 emissions from back in the 2006 timeframe to what actually occurred by 2015, lots of the southeastern states, and I think it just generally East Coast, we've seen the electric generating unit sector have to deal with CARE, then cross-state rule. So there's been kind of similar kinds of reductions across the eastern U.S. I'll give some thought to think if there's a good example in the western U.S. or even if there's one in eastern U.S. There are, if you look at any of EPA's work on the residual non-attainment areas, if you look at the areas that might be non-attainment for the 2015 standard, those areas continue to shrink. If you go back in time and look at areas that were number of non-attainment areas from 2008, from the 2008 standard to now, the areas continue to shrink, and it's due in large part to the combination of EGU controls, but also all of those mobile source programs. I mean, we're seeing tremendous reductions all across the country. But let me think a little bit more about that, and if there's a comparison.
Yeah, people always point at Kentucky and West Virginia. I know those may come up. But
Sheila, wonderful talk. As always, you explain it extremely well. But I have a question for you, and that deals with, yes, indeed, the air quality in the state of North Carolina has improved dramatically. But is it not true that we simply got lucky? And we got lucky because there is all this fracked gas that is coming so cheaply that is not producing the sulfur that coal-powered power plants were producing. That's number one. And two, for the first time, I heard yesterday on NPR that globally, energy produced by solar energy was larger than the capacity by coal production. That's a huge development worldwide. But the reason I mention that is state of North Carolina is one of the leaders in solar production. So I'm asking, are we simply getting lucky, or is it because something in the policy that is making it all this happen?
So I think I'm going to answer that a couple of different ways, Vinay, and good question. I think in terms of the standards that were before us when we were when Clean Smokestacks was being debated, I think we would have achieved those with the planned reductions. Our models indicated that. The emissions were pretty much on target, say in 2009, when you had the ozone attainment date, you had the PM 2.5 attainment date. So that part wasn't luck. I think 2009 and beyond, right, those extra reductions, going back to being below the...
Yep, there it is. This dramatic reduction.
That was due, the additional reductions, I think, are due in large part to the conversion to natural gas, as well as, meeting the renewable energy portfolio standard in North Carolina. And neither of those were contemplated when the legislation passed.
So let me ask my second question, which is, the title of your talk was Progress in Improving North Carolina Air Quality. So you've talked about, in general, the criteria pollutants and how we had dramatically improved air quality vis-a-vis the criteria pollutant, specifically PM 2.5 and ozone. So my question is, you go to eastern North Carolina and you have all this amount of pollution which is related to ammonia and the hogways. What have we done?
Not very much. So again, I think we talked about making the case. Bill talked about that especially. So when we think about what to do with ammonia, I think we have to have the case, whether it's visibility or PM 2.5. We had my going in theory, if you will, as we were starting to set out the PM 2.5 monitors across the state back in 1999, was that the eastern coastal plain would be where we saw the highest PM 2.5 concentrations. Lots of ammonia, lots of SO2 being transported there from our power plants, from South Carolina power plants, et cetera. And then we started operating the monitors, and we didn't see that, and we didn't see violations of the PM 2.5 standard at those monitors. And so I think policymakers have to have the legitimate case that the technology or the technical analysis says we need to do more. And so on the air front, I don't have that yet. And I wanted to come back to this as we were looking at, and this was Great Smokies, but let's say we pulled up Swan Quarter, which is our eastern North Carolina Class 1 area. The response was might have been a little bit higher, but it still would have been overwhelmed by the benefits from controlling SO2 from power plants and industrial boilers. So I think